Emotional manipulation in relationships is a subtle yet damaging form of psychological control, often hidden beneath behaviors that seem harmless, affectionate, or even protective. At its core, emotional manipulation involves one person exploiting another's emotions, insecurities, or vulnerabilities to achieve personal objectives, maintain power, or exert control over the relationship. Unlike explicit forms of abuse, emotional manipulation thrives precisely because it disguises itself so effectively as genuine care, concern, or love. This makes it particularly insidious, as the victim often remains unaware, convinced instead that their own feelings of inadequacy, guilt, or confusion result from personal shortcomings rather than intentional manipulation by their partner. One hallmark characteristic of emotional manipulation is the intentional distortion of reality, known as gaslighting. Gaslighting leads individuals to doubt their perceptions, memories, or even their own judgment, creating a cycle of self-doubt and emotional dependency. For example, manipulators might repeatedly deny past statements or actions, accuse their partner of misunderstanding situations, or trivialize genuine concerns to the point where the victim questions their own sanity. Over time, this undermines the victim's confidence and ability to trust their instincts, further strengthening the manipulator's control. Another key characteristic is guilt tripping, a tactic frequently employed by emotional manipulators. This occurs when manipulators intentionally induce guilt or shame to gain compliance or sympathy from their partners. They might portray themselves as helpless victims who are misunderstood or unfairly accused, thus positioning the genuine victim as the cause of their emotional distress. Consequently, the victim begins to prioritize the manipulator's emotions over their own, often making considerable personal sacrifices to appease the manipulator's demands or avoid conflict. Manipulators also commonly utilize subtle intimidation, not necessarily through threats of physical violence, but through emotional punishments, such as silent treatments, withdrawal of affection, or passive-aggressive comments. Such behaviors create anxiety and uncertainty, leading victims to consistently walk on eggshells to avoid upsetting their partner. This emotional environment effectively discourages victims from voicing concerns or asserting boundaries, as they fear emotional repercussions. Additionally, emotional manipulators frequently employ flattery or superficial charm to disarm their victims initially. Early in the relationship, they might shower the partner with attention, praise, and intense affection, a process known as love bombing. As a result, the victim becomes emotionally attached quickly, believing that they have found an ideal partner. Later, however, these same gestures become strategic tools used intermittently to maintain control, reward compliant behavior, or entice the victim back into compliance after conflicts. Ultimately, emotional manipulation operates through gradual erosion of the victim's emotional autonomy, self-esteem, and sense of reality. Victims may fail to recognize this process due to its gradual nature, mistakenly attributing discomfort or distress in the relationship to their own inadequacies rather than manipulative tactics. Recognizing emotional manipulation requires careful reflection, awareness of one's emotional state, and understanding of healthy relationship boundaries. Without awareness, manipulation continues unchecked, quietly undermining the emotional well-being and autonomy of the victim. Emotional manipulation in relationships involves a variety of subtle techniques that manipulators deliberately use to control, confuse, and emotionally destabilize their partners. These techniques are often sophisticated, difficult to detect immediately, and disguised as ordinary behavior or genuine affection. One of the most common tactics is gaslighting, a psychological technique designed to make the victim doubt their own memory, judgment, or perceptions. Gaslighting is characterized by manipulators repeatedly challenging facts or past events, subtly denying statements they made, or deliberately twisting reality. Over time, victims begin to lose confidence in their perceptions, ultimately becoming dependent on their manipulators for validation or emotional security. Another prominent method of emotional manipulation is guilt tripping, This occurs when manipulators deliberately evoke guilt or shame in their partner as a means to control their behavior. For instance, a manipulator might express disappointment, sadness, or hurt feelings whenever their partner sets boundaries, tries to assert themselves, or fails to meet unrealistic expectations. By consistently positioning themselves as victims, manipulators create an emotional obligation that compels the victim to comply with demands, often against their own wishes or well-being. Silent treatment or emotional withdrawal is also frequently employed by emotional manipulators. This method involves deliberately ignoring or emotionally isolating a partner as punishment for undesirable behaviors or disagreements. Rather than addressing conflicts directly through open communication, manipulators intentionally withdraw affection, refuse to speak, or become cold and distant, forcing their partner into a state of anxiety and emotional discomfort. Over time, victims become conditioned to fear emotional abandonment, leading them to suppress their own needs or opinions in order to avoid emotional rejection. Victim playing is another manipulative strategy whereby manipulators frequently portray themselves as powerless, misunderstood, or unfairly criticized. By consistently positioning themselves as victims, manipulators reverse accountability, shifting blame onto their partner. This tactic enables manipulators to avoid responsibility for their actions or behaviors, creating a scenario where the genuine victim feels obligated to apologize, comfort, or accommodate the manipulator's demands. As a result, manipulators effectively maintain emotional control by eliciting constant sympathy or emotional investment from their partner. Additionally, emotional manipulators utilize love bombing, particularly early in relationships, as a way to quickly create emotional dependency. Love bombing involves overwhelming the partner with excessive attention, affection, praise, gifts, or romantic gestures. Initially, these behaviors seem genuine and deeply affectionate, creating intense emotional bonds. However, manipulators later exploit these strong emotional attachments by strategically withdrawing affection or using intermittent rewards to control the relationship dynamic. This intermittent reinforcement causes victims to crave validation and affection, ultimately binding them emotionally to the manipulator. Another subtle technique manipulators use is projecting their flaws or negative behaviors onto their partner. By accusing the partner of possessing characteristics or behaviors they themselves exhibit, manipulators deflect accountability and create confusion. Victims become distracted, constantly defending themselves against false accusations rather than recognizing the manipulator's toxic patterns. In sum, emotional manipulators utilize an intricate combination of psychological tactics, gaslighting, guilt-tripping, silent treatment, victim playing, love bombing, and projection to maintain emotional dominance. These methods are intentionally subtle and insidious, often difficult to identify clearly until substantial emotional damage has occurred. Recognizing these techniques is critical for protecting oneself against manipulation and establishing healthier relationship boundaries. Emotional manipulation in relationships is notoriously difficult to identify, precisely because it disguises itself within everyday interactions that seem normal, caring, or even loving at first glance. Unlike overt forms of abuse, such as physical aggression, yelling, or explicit threats, emotional manipulation operates silently, using subtle psychological tactics that blend seamlessly into routine behaviors and communication. This subtlety makes manipulation uniquely deceptive. Victims typically fail to notice its presence, interpreting manipulative actions as genuine concern or love. One primary reason emotional manipulation remains unnoticed is the gradual nature with which it unfolds. Manipulative relationships often begin positively, characterized by gestures of intense affection, attention, and apparent devotion. This early stage of intense emotional bonding, often termed love bombing, creates a powerful emotional attachment that significantly impairs the victim's ability to recognize unhealthy behaviors later on. As manipulation intensifies slowly over time, each incremental boundary violation or controlling behavior appears insignificant in isolation. Victims often rationalize, dismiss, or justify these behaviors as momentary lapses or minor misunderstandings, rather than recognizing the emerging pattern of manipulation. Another reason emotional manipulation often goes unrecognized is that manipulative individuals frequently present themselves as caring, compassionate, or supportive. Their harmful behaviors are cleverly cloaked in displays of concern, making it easy for victims to mistake manipulation for genuine care. For instance, a manipulator might use controlling or possessive behaviors under the guise of protecting their partner, expressing jealousy as proof of deep love. Consequently, victims struggle to distinguish genuine affection from manipulative control, mistaking red flags for signs of deep emotional investment. The technique of gaslighting further contributes to the difficulty victims experience in recognizing manipulation. By deliberately distorting reality and undermining their partner's perceptions, manipulators create confusion, self-doubt, and anxiety in their victims. This intentional erosion of the victim's trust in their own judgment makes them increasingly reliant on the manipulator for validation. Over time, victims internalize feelings of inadequacy, believing they themselves are responsible for relationship conflicts, misunderstandings, or emotional distress. This false sense of accountability blinds them to the true source of their unhappiness, allowing the manipulation to continue unchecked. Societal misunderstandings and stigmas about what constitutes abuse further obscure emotional manipulation. Many individuals falsely associate abusive behavior exclusively with overt aggression or violence, overlooking more subtle forms of emotional harm. When victims attempt to express discomfort about manipulative behaviors, they might encounter skepticism or disbelief from friends, family, or even professionals who fail to recognize the severity of emotional manipulation. This external invalidation further reinforces the victim's confusion and silence, discouraging them from seeking help or identifying their experiences accurately. Additionally, emotional manipulation is deeply tied to the victim's own vulnerabilities, insecurities, and emotional needs. Victims frequently dismiss manipulative behavior due to fear of abandonment, rejection, or loneliness, believing enduring emotional discomfort is preferable to losing the relationship altogether. The emotional investment already established through manipulation creates powerful psychological incentives to overlook problematic behavior, rather than confront or challenge it. Ultimately, the difficulty in recognizing emotional manipulation arises from its subtlety, gradual escalation, intentional confusion, societal misconceptions, and exploitation of emotional vulnerabilities. Understanding these factors is essential for individuals to identify manipulation early, empowering them to take steps toward emotional safety and recovery. Recognizing emotional manipulation in relationships requires careful attention to specific warning signs that indicate unhealthy or controlling dynamics. While subtle, these signs often reveal themselves through the consistent emotional and psychological discomfort experienced by the victim. One prominent indicator is the persistent feeling of guilt or anxiety whenever the victim attempts to express personal boundaries, desires, or opinions that differ from the manipulators. If an individual regularly experiences guilt or shame simply for asserting their needs, this strongly suggests manipulation is at play. Such feelings arise because the manipulator deliberately fosters an emotional environment where independence or disagreement is seen as a betrayal, thus conditioning the victim to self-censor or withdraw emotionally. Another significant warning sign is ongoing self-doubt or confusion about one's own perceptions and decisions, often resulting from gaslighting. A victim of emotional manipulation frequently finds themselves questioning their memories, feelings, or sanity due to repeated denials, distortions, or contradictory statements from their partner. This continuous internal conflict leads the victim to lose trust in their judgment and increasingly rely on the manipulator's perspective for validation. Over time, this erodes the victim's self-confidence, rendering them emotionally dependent and less able to identify or challenge manipulative behavior. Additionally, emotional manipulation often manifests through an imbalance of emotional power within the relationship. Victims often experience a chronic sense of emotional exhaustion, anxiety, or stress because the relationship consistently revolves around meeting the manipulator's needs, emotions, and demands. This imbalance results in the victim constantly managing the manipulator's moods, walking on eggshells to prevent emotional outbursts, silent treatments, or passive-aggressive reactions. Such emotional hypervigilance indicates that the relationship dynamics are unhealthy and manipulative, as genuine partnerships do not require constant emotional self-sacrifice or fear of emotional repercussions. Isolation from friends, family, or social support networks also frequently occurs as a result of emotional manipulation. Manipulators may subtly undermine these relationships, criticizing friends or family, questioning their motives, or creating scenarios that isolate the victim from external support. Gradual isolation weakens the victim's ability to seek external validation or support, further reinforcing the manipulator's control. Recognizing these warning signs, persistent guilt, self-doubt, anxiety, emotional exhaustion, and social isolation, is crucial in identifying emotional manipulation. Awareness of these indicators allows individuals to take proactive steps to restore their emotional well-being, establish clearer boundaries, and seek necessary support to exit toxic relationship patterns. Protecting oneself from emotional manipulation requires a proactive and mindful approach, centered around cultivating self-awareness, establishing firm boundaries, and strengthening emotional resilience. The first and most critical step toward protection involves developing a deeper understanding of one's emotional responses and vulnerabilities. Recognizing emotional manipulation early depends largely on being aware of personal triggers, insecurities, or fears that manipulators commonly exploit. Increased emotional self-awareness enables individuals to detect when boundaries are being violated, or when interactions leave them feeling anxious, guilty, or confused, signaling that manipulation may be occurring. Another essential aspect of protection involves setting clear and consistent personal boundaries. Boundaries are psychological and emotional limits individuals establish to protect themselves from exploitation or harm. To effectively resist emotional manipulation, it is vital to define and maintain these boundaries openly and assertively. Clear communication of what behaviors or interactions are acceptable, and more importantly, what are not, makes it more difficult for manipulators to breach those boundaries without consequences. Consistently enforcing boundaries helps individuals regain emotional control, reassert personal autonomy, and reduce vulnerability to manipulation. Strengthening self-confidence and trust in one's perceptions is equally important in safeguarding against emotional manipulation. Manipulators thrive by creating doubt and confusion. Thus, nurturing self-confidence and validating one's emotions helps individuals resist manipulative tactics such as gaslighting and guilt-tripping. Techniques such as journaling, counseling, and open communication with trusted friends or family can significantly enhance emotional resilience and reinforce one's sense of reality, thereby weakening a manipulator's influence. Additionally, fostering healthy support networks plays a crucial role in protection from manipulation. Manipulators frequently attempt to isolate their partners from supportive friends and family to maintain control. Therefore, actively maintaining and nurturing strong supportive relationships outside of the manipulative relationship can provide critical external perspectives, validation, and emotional support. Sharing experiences and concerns with trustworthy individuals reduces isolation and ensures victims receive objective insights, enabling them to clearly recognize manipulative behaviors. Finally, developing the willingness and ability to disengage from toxic relationships is an essential protective strategy. Recognizing when a relationship is harmful or manipulative and having the courage to step away can profoundly restore emotional health and autonomy. Sometimes protecting oneself necessitates seeking professional help, therapists, counselors, or support groups to facilitate recovery and rebuild emotional strength. Ultimately, protection against emotional manipulation is rooted in awareness, clear boundaries, emotional strength support networks, and the courage to walk away when necessary.